The California sun beat down mercilessly on Hammond Avenue in Fresno, casting long shadows across the modest residential neighborhood. It was March 12, 2004, and the afternoon heat shimmered off the asphalt as two police cruisers pulled up to a nondescript single-story house with peeling paint and overgrown weeds choking the front yard. Officer Sarah Martinez stepped out of her patrol car, adjusting her radio as she surveyed the scene. The house at 761 West Hammond Avenue looked like any other in this working-class neighborhood, except for the eerie silence that seemed to emanate from within its walls. No children's laughter, no sounds of daily life, just an oppressive quiet that made her skin crawl. "Dispatch said it was a custody dispute?" asked her partner, Officer James Rodriguez, as he joined her on the cracked sidewalk. "That's what the call said. Two women claiming their children are being held inside against their will." Martinez glanced at her notepad. "Ruby Ortiz and Sofina Solorio. They say the children's father won't let them leave." The officers had responded to similar calls before. Domestic disputes that usually ended with heated arguments and paperwork, but something about this house felt different. The windows were covered with thick curtains, and the yard was enclosed by a tall wooden fence that blocked most of the view from the street. As they approached the front door, Martinez noticed movement behind one of the curtained windows. A shadow passed quickly, then disappeared. She exchanged a glance with Rodriguez, both officers instinctively placing their hands near their service weapons. The front door opened before they could knock. Marcus Wesson stood in the doorway like a biblical patriarch stepped out of time. At 57 years old, he was an imposing figure, 6 feet tall, with long graying dreadlocks that fell past his shoulders and a beard that reached his chest. His dark eyes held an unsettling intensity, and despite the warm weather, he wore a long black coat that gave him an almost ministerial appearance. "Officers," he said, in a voice that was surprisingly soft and measured, "I've been expecting you." Martinez felt a chill run down her spine. There was something about the man's calm demeanor that seemed unnatural, as if he existed in a different reality from everyone else. "Mr. Wesson, we're here about a custody dispute. We need to speak with you about some children." Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, please come in, but I must warn you, my family is very private. We don't often have visitors from the outside world." The way he said "outside world" made Rodriguez's hand move closer to his radio. As they stepped across the threshold, both officers were immediately struck by the house's interior. The living room was dimly lit, with heavy curtains blocking most of the natural light. Religious artwork covered the walls, not traditional Christian imagery, but strange, handmade pieces that seemed to blend various spiritual symbols in disturbing ways. The air was thick and stifling, carrying the scent of incense mixed with something else, something organic and unpleasant that neither officer could identify. In the corner of the room sat an old television, but it was turned off, its black screen reflecting the room like a dark mirror. "Where are the children, Mr. Wesson?" Martinez asked, her training kicking in as she scanned the room for any signs of the kids they'd been called about. "They're resting," Marcus replied, his hands clasped behind his back. "It's been a difficult day for our family. You see, some of our relatives have been influenced by outside forces. They've forgotten the sacred bonds that hold our family together." Rodriguez frowned. "Sir, we need to see the children. We have reports that they're being held here against their will." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flash of something cold and calculating. "Officer, my family chooses to live according to God's will, not the corrupted laws of this fallen world. The children you speak of are exactly where they belong, under their father's protection." The house seemed to grow quieter, if that was possible. Martinez strained to hear any sounds of children, voices, footsteps, anything that would indicate life beyond the 3 adults standing in this suffocating living room. "Mr. Wesson, I'm going to need you to call the children out here so we can speak with them," she said firmly. For a long moment, Marcus simply stared at her. Then slowly, he shook his head. I'm afraid that won't be possible, officer. You see, my children understand something that the outside world has forgotten. They know that a father's love is absolute, and that God has chosen me to guide them on the righteous path. They would never choose to leave their family. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Rodriguez stepped closer to his partner, both officers now fully alert to the possibility that this was far more serious than a simple custody dispute. "Sir, we're going to need to see those children now," Martinez said, her voice carrying the authority of her badge. "This isn't a request." Marcus's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too white in the dim light. "Of course, officer, but first, let me ask you something. Do you have children of your own?" The question hung in the air like a threat. Martinez felt her heart rate increase as she realized they might be dealing with something far more dangerous than they'd initially thought. From somewhere deep within the house, a sound drifted toward them, so faint it was almost imperceptible. It might have been crying, or it might have been the wind. But in that moment, both officers knew with absolute certainty that whatever was happening in this house, it was far from normal. Marcus Wesson continued to smile, his dark eyes reflecting nothing but an unsettling calm as the shadows in the room seemed to grow longer and deeper. Ruby Ortiz paced frantically outside the house, her hands shaking as she clutched her cell phone. At 25, she had the worn look of someone who had seen too much, too young. Her sister Sofina stood beside her, both women watching the police officers disappear into the house that had haunted their nightmares for years. "They don't understand," Ruby whispered to Sofina, her voice barely audible above the sound of traffic on Hammond Avenue. "They think this is just some family argument. They have no idea what he's capable of." Sofina, 2 years younger but with the same haunted expression, nodded grimly. "We should have brought more proof. Pictures, documents, something." "What proof?" Ruby's voice cracked. "Who would believe us? Who would believe that a man could turn his own house into a prison, his own children into—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Inside the house, Officer Martinez was growing increasingly uncomfortable with Marcus Wesson's evasive answers. Every question about the children was met with philosophical rambling about God's will and the corruption of the outside world. "Mr. Wesson, I'm going to ask you one more time. Where are the children?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. "They're in the back room, officer, but I must warn you, they've been taught to fear outsiders. Your presence here might upset them." Rodriguez had been quietly observing the house's layout, noting the narrow hallway that led toward the back of the property. The house seemed larger than it appeared from the outside, with rooms extending further back than the typical tract home design. "We'll need to speak with them individually," Martinez said. "It's standard procedure in custody cases." "Of course," Marcus replied, but he made no move toward the back of the house. Instead, he continued to stand in the living room, his presence somehow filling the entire space despite his calm demeanor. The sound came again, that faint crying or whimpering from the back of the house. This time, both officers heard it clearly. "Sir, we need to go back there now," Rodriguez said, his hand moving to his radio. Marcus's expression finally changed. The serene mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and desperate underneath. "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding. My family is very fragile right now. Any disruption could cause irreparable harm." Martinez felt her training kick into high gear. The man's body language had shifted completely, from calm and controlled to tense and defensive. Whatever was in the back of this house, Marcus Wesson was desperate to keep them from seeing it. "Mr. Wesson, step aside. We're going to check on the children now." For a moment, Marcus didn't move. He stood blocking the hallway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. "Very well. But please remember, whatever happens next, I tried to protect them from this moment." The hallway was even darker than the living room, lit only by a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows on the walls. As they walked toward the back of the house, Martinez noticed that the walls were covered with more of the strange religious artwork, handmade drawings and paintings that seemed to depict a twisted version of biblical scenes. The crying sound was getting louder now, accompanied by what sounded like hushed voices. Rodriguez called for backup on his radio, speaking in low tones as they approached a closed door at the end of the hallway. "This is it," Marcus said softly from behind them. "The room where my children wait for their father's guidance." Martinez reached for the door handle, but it was locked. "Mr. Wesson, open this door." "I don't have the key," he replied, but his voice had changed again. The calm was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like panic. Rodriguez was about to radio for additional units when they heard a new sound from behind the door, a man's voice speaking in urgent, hushed tones. It wasn't Marcus, who was standing right behind them. "Who else is in there?" Martinez demanded. Marcus's face had gone pale. "My son, Dorian. He's protecting the children." The pieces were starting to come together in Martinez's mind, and none of them painted a picture she wanted to see. A locked room, crying children, and now another adult male who was apparently protecting them from police officers. "Mr. Wesson, I need you to call out to your son and tell him to open this door immediately." Marcus shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. Dorian has been taught that outsiders are the enemy. He believes that you're here to destroy our family." The voices behind the door had gone quiet now, which somehow made the situation feel even more dangerous. Martinez could feel her heart pounding as she realized they might be dealing with a barricaded suspect situation. "Dorian!" Marcus called out suddenly, his voice carrying a strange authority. "The officers need to see that the children are safe. Open the door." Silence. Then, from behind the door, came a voice that chilled both officers to the bone. It was young, maybe early 20s, but filled with a fanatical intensity that spoke of years of indoctrination. "Father, they want to take the children away from us. They want to separate our family." "I know, son, but we must show them that our children are protected by God's love." Martinez exchanged a look with Rodriguez. They both knew they were no longer dealing with a simple custody dispute. This was something far more complex and dangerous, a situation that required immediate backup and possibly specialized units. As if reading her thoughts, Rodriguez was already on his radio, calling for additional officers and a supervisor. But even as help was on the way, Martinez couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late, that whatever had been happening in this house for years was about to reach its terrible conclusion. The door remained locked, the voices behind it had gone silent, and Marcus Wesson stood in the hallway with that same unsettling smile, as if he knew something they didn't, something that would change everything. The backup units arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the afternoon air like warnings of impending doom. Sergeant Michael Torres, a 20-year veteran of the Fresno Police Department, took one look at the scene and immediately called for additional resources. The house on Hammond Avenue was no longer just a custody dispute. It had become a potential hostage situation. Inside the locked room, 9-year-old Sabrina Wesson pressed herself against the wall, her small body trembling as she listened to the voices in the hallway. Around her, 8 other children huddled together in the cramped space, her siblings and cousins, ranging in age from 1 to 17 years old. The room itself was a testament to years of isolation and control. Mattresses were scattered across the floor, and the windows had been boarded up from the inside. Religious texts and handmade drawings covered every available surface, all depicting the same twisted theology that Marcus had been preaching for over 2 decades. Dorian Wesson, Marcus's 28-year-old son, stood guard at the door with a pistol in his hand. His eyes held the same fanatical intensity as his father's, but where Marcus projected calm control, Dorian radiated barely contained panic. "They're going to try to separate us," he whispered to the children, his voice shaking. "But Father taught us what to do if this day ever came." 17-year-old Kiani Wesson, who was both Marcus's daughter and the mother of two of the younger children in the room, tried to comfort the crying toddlers while her own heart raced with terror. She had lived her entire life in this house, raised on her father's teachings that the outside world was evil and that their family was chosen by God for a special purpose. But now, hearing the police officers' voices through the door, she felt something she had never experienced before, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to live. "Dorian," she said softly, "maybe we should listen to what they have to say." Her brother's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing with the fervor of a true believer. "You've been corrupted by outside influences, just like Aunt Ruby and Aunt Safina. Father warned us this would happen." Outside the room, Sergeant Torres was coordinating with the crisis negotiation team while trying to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. The initial reports from Officers Martinez and Rodriguez painted a picture of a highly controlled domestic environment, but the locked room and armed individual inside suggested something far more dangerous. "Mr. Wesson?" Torres addressed Marcus, who remained eerily calm despite the growing police presence in his home. "We need you to convince your son to open that door and let the children come out safely." Marcus stroked his long beard thoughtfully. "Sergeant, you must understand that my family has been preparing for this day for many years. We knew that eventually the corrupt world would try to destroy what God has built here. Sir, nobody wants to destroy anything. We just need to make sure the children are safe." "Safe?" Marcus's laugh was soft but chilling. "Sergeant, do you know what happens to children when they're taken from their families and placed in the care of strangers? Do you know how the outside world corrupts innocent souls?" Torres had dealt with religious extremists before, but there was something particularly unsettling about Marcus Wesson's calm certainty. The man spoke as if he genuinely believed he was protecting his children from a fate worse than death. Inside the room, the tension was reaching a breaking point. Dorian was pacing back and forth, the gun trembling in his hand as he muttered prayers and fragments of his father's teachings. The younger children were crying openly now, sensing the fear and desperation of the adults around them. "Dorian, please," Kiani whispered. "The babies are scared. Maybe if we just talk to the police officers." "No!" Dorian's voice cracked like a whip. "Father taught us that this day would come. He taught us that we must be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice to keep our family together." The words sent a chill through Kiani's heart. She knew what her father had taught them about the ultimate sacrifice, the belief that death was preferable to separation from the family. It was a teaching that had always seemed abstract, theoretical. Now, with her brother holding a gun and police officers demanding entry, it was becoming terrifyingly real. Outside, Torres was growing increasingly concerned about the length of the standoff. In his experience, the longer these situations dragged on, the more likely they were to end in tragedy. He made the decision to bring in specialized negotiators and to start evacuating the neighboring houses. "Mr. Wesson, I'm going to ask you one more time to help us resolve this peacefully. We have trained negotiators on the way, but right now, you're the only one who can convince your son to put down his weapon and let us help your family." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to look through Torres rather than at him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made everyone in the hallway feel the gravity of the situation. "Sergeant, my son is doing exactly what I taught him to do. He's protecting our family from those who would destroy it. If you truly want to help, you'll leave us in peace." "Sir, that's not going to happen. We have a responsibility to ensure the safety of those children. And I have a responsibility to ensure their souls remain pure." The standoff continued as the sun began to set over Fresno, casting long shadows through the boarded-up windows of the house on Hammond Avenue. Inside the locked room, 9 children waited in terror as their world, the only world they had ever known, began to crumble around them. None of them could have imagined that within hours their family would be torn apart forever, and that the man they had been taught to worship as a prophet would be revealed as something far more sinister. The ultimate sacrifice that Marcus Wesson had prepared them for was about to be demanded, and the price would be higher than anyone could have imagined. As darkness fell over Hammond Avenue, the house had become the center of a massive police operation. Crisis negotiators, SWAT teams, and emergency medical personnel surrounded the property while news vans began gathering at the perimeter. What had started as a routine custody call was now making headlines across California. Inside the locked room, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Dorian Wesson had been pacing for hours, his grip on the pistol growing tighter as his father's teachings echoed in his mind. The children huddled together on the mattresses, their fear palpable in the stifling air. "Father says the end times are coming," Dorian muttered, more to himself than to the children. "He says that God will test our faith, and only the pure will be saved." Kiani watched her brother with growing horror, recognizing the signs of complete psychological breakdown. She had seen this before in other family members who had been pushed too far by their father's demands, but never with a gun involved. Never with the lives of children hanging in the balance. "Dorian, listen to me," she said softly, trying to keep her voice calm despite her terror. "These children are innocent. Whatever Father taught us, they don't deserve to suffer for it." Her brother's eyes snapped to hers, wild and unfocused. "They're not suffering, Kiani. They're being saved. Don't you understand? Father taught us that death is just a doorway to paradise, but only if we die pure, untouched by the corruption of the outside world." The youngest children began crying again, sensing the escalating tension. 1-year-old Jeva Wesson, who was both Marcus's daughter and granddaughter, reached out toward Kiani with tiny hands, seeking comfort that Kiani desperately wanted to provide, but felt powerless to give. Outside the room, the crisis negotiation team had taken over communications with Marcus. Detective Lisa Chen, a specialist in dealing with religious extremists, was trying to establish a rapport with the man who held the key to resolving the situation peacefully. "Marcus, I understand that your family is very important to you," she said through the door. "I can see that you've worked hard to protect them from what you see as a dangerous world." Marcus's response came after a long pause. "Detective, you speak as if you understand, but you don't. You can't comprehend the level of corruption that exists in your world. My children have been raised in purity, in the light of God's true word. What you're asking me to do is to throw them into darkness. I'm asking you to give them a chance to make their own choices. Isn't that what God would want? For his children to choose their own path?" The question seemed to strike something deep within Marcus. For the first time since the standoff began, his composure cracked slightly. "You don't understand the burden I carry, Detective. I've been chosen to guide these souls to salvation. If I fail in that mission..." His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. In Marcus Wesson's twisted theology, failure to protect his family from the outside world was a sin that could damn them all. Inside the room, Dorian was becoming increasingly agitated. He had stopped pacing and was now standing directly in front of the door, the gun pointed toward it, as if expecting the police to break through at any moment. "They're going to come for us soon," he told the children. "When they do, remember what Father taught us. Remember that we're a family, and families stay together forever." Sabrina, the 9-year-old, looked up at her older brother with eyes that held far too much understanding for her age. "Dorian, I'm scared. I don't want to die." The simple, honest statement from the child seemed to cut through some of Dorian's fanatical haze. For a moment, his hand holding the gun wavered, and Kiani saw a flicker of the brother she remembered from before their father's teachings had consumed him completely. "I'm scared too," he whispered. And for the first time, he sounded like the young man he was, rather than the religious zealot he had been trained to become. but the moment of clarity was brief. From the hallway came the sound of Marcus's voice, calling out to his son with the same hypnotic authority he had wielded over his family for decades. "Dorian, my son, remember your purpose. Remember why God chose our family for this trial. The children are depending on you to keep them safe from corruption." The words seemed to snap Dorian back into his fanatical state. His grip on the gun tightened, and his eyes regained their wild intensity. "Yes, father," he called back. "I remember." Outside, Detective Chen was growing increasingly concerned about the psychological pressure being applied to the armed individual in the room. She had dealt with family-based cults before, and she knew that the combination of religious extremism and family loyalty could create a powder keg of unpredictable violence. "Marcus, I need you to help me understand something," she said. "If God chose your family for a special purpose, wouldn't he want you to trust in his plan? Maybe this situation is part of that plan. Maybe he's giving your children a chance to spread his word to the outside world." It was a calculated risk, trying to use Marcus's own religious beliefs to convince him to cooperate. But Chen could sense that traditional negotiation tactics weren't going to work with someone who operated from such a fundamentally different worldview. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, and Chen could almost hear him wrestling with the theological implications of her words. When he finally responded, his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Detective, you're asking me to gamble with the souls of my children. If I'm wrong, if the outside world corrupts them, then I will have failed in my most sacred duty. And if you're wrong about keeping them isolated, you might be denying them the chance to fulfill God's true plan for their lives." The standoff had now lasted over 6 hours, and everyone involved knew that time was running out. Inside the locked room, 9 children waited in terror while their fate was decided by adults whose grip on reality had been shattered by years of isolation and indoctrination. The breaking point was approaching, and when it came, the consequences would reverberate far beyond the walls of the house on Hammond Avenue. At 11:47 p.m., the sound that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives echoed through the house on Hammond Avenue. It was a single gunshot, followed by screaming, then an eerie silence that seemed to swallow all other sounds. Detective Chen felt her blood turn to ice as she realized that all their hours of negotiation had failed. "Move, move, move!" she shouted into her radio as the SWAT team prepared to breach the locked door. Inside the room, chaos had erupted in the span of seconds. Dorian Wesson, pushed beyond his breaking point by hours of psychological pressure and his father's relentless indoctrination, had made the decision that would destroy what remained of his family forever. The first shot had been fired into the ceiling, a warning or perhaps a moment of hesitation before the unthinkable. But as the police officers began shouting and preparing to break down the door, something inside Dorian snapped completely. "We have to stay together," he whispered to the terrified children, his voice now completely detached from reality. "Father says families that love each other stay together forever." Kiani threw herself between her brother and the younger children, her maternal instincts overriding her own terror. "Dorian, no, please, they're just babies." But the young man who had once played with these same children, who had helped raise them in the only home they had ever known, was gone. In his place stood someone who had been so thoroughly broken by years of psychological manipulation that he could no longer distinguish between love and destruction. The SWAT team breached the door just as the second shot rang out. What they found inside would be seared into their memories forever, a scene of such senseless tragedy that even veteran officers would require counseling to process what they witnessed. 9 children, ranging in age from 1 to 17, lay scattered across the room. Some had been shot, others appeared to have been suffocated or strangled. The mattresses that had served as their beds were now soaked with blood, and the religious artwork on the walls seemed to mock the horror that had unfolded beneath them. Dorian Wesson sat in the corner of the room, the gun still in his hand, staring at nothing with eyes that had gone completely vacant. He offered no resistance as officers swarmed the room, didn't even seem to notice their presence. In the hallway, Marcus Wesson's reaction to the sound of gunshots was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire tragedy. He didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't show any of the emotions one would expect from a father who had just lost 9 children. Instead, he simply nodded, as if the massacre had been exactly what he had expected all along. "It's finished," he said quietly to Detective Chen. "My children are safe now. They'll never be corrupted by your world." "Ubi," the words hit Chen like a physical blow. In that moment, she understood the full scope of the psychological manipulation that had led to this tragedy. Marcus Wesson hadn't just failed to prevent the deaths of his children, he had orchestrated them through years of systematic indoctrination that had convinced his son that murder was an act of love. Emergency medical personnel rushed into the room, but it was too late. 9 young lives had been snuffed out in a matter of minutes, victims of a twisted ideology that had turned a family home into a tomb. As Marcus Wesson was led away in handcuffs, he showed no remorse, no grief, no recognition of the magnitude of what had just occurred. To him, the deaths of his children weren't a tragedy. They were a victory over the forces of corruption that he believed threatened their souls. The investigation that followed would reveal the full extent of the horror that had been hidden behind the walls of 761 West Hammond Avenue. For over 2 decades, Marcus Wesson had systematically isolated his family from the outside world, creating a domestic cult where he was the absolute authority and his children were both his followers and his victims. The surviving family members, those who had escaped or been away from the house that night, would tell investigators about years of sexual abuse, forced marriages between family members, and a religious doctrine that had been twisted to justify every form of exploitation imaginable. Ruby Ortiz and Sofina Solorio, the 2 women whose custody dispute had triggered the police response, would live with the knowledge that their attempt to save their children had instead precipitated their deaths. The guilt would follow them for the rest of their lives, even though everyone involved knew that the tragedy had been set in motion long before that March evening. The house on Hammond Avenue would eventually be demolished, but the memory of what happened there would linger in the community for decades. It served as a stark reminder of how easily love could be perverted into control, how faith could be twisted into fanaticism, and how the very institutions meant to protect children, family, religion, home, could become the instruments of their destruction. Marcus Wesson's trial would reveal even more disturbing details about the systematic abuse that had occurred within his family. But for the 9 children who died that night, justice would come too late. They had lived their entire lives as prisoners in their own home, and they had died as victims of a man who claimed to love them more than life itself. The case would become a landmark in the study of domestic cults and family-based abuse. But for those who lived through it, it would always be remembered as the night when a father's twisted love destroyed everything it claimed to protect. 6 months after the massacre on Hammond Avenue, the Fresno County Courthouse became the stage for one of the most disturbing trials in California's history. Marcus Wesson sat in the defendant's chair with the same unsettling calm he had displayed on that terrible night, showing no emotion as prosecutors detailed the systematic abuse and manipulation that had led to the deaths of 9 children. Detective Chen, now permanently assigned to the case, had spent months interviewing surviving family members and piecing together the full scope of Marcus's crimes. What emerged was a picture of psychological manipulation so complete and devastating that it challenged everything the investigators thought they knew about family dynamics and religious extremism. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, District Attorney Elizabeth Morrison began her opening statement. This case is about a man who used the sacred bonds of family and faith as weapons against the most vulnerable members of our society. Marcus Wesson didn't just fail to protect his children, he systematically destroyed their ability to protect themselves. The evidence presented during the trial painted a horrifying picture of life inside the Wesson household. Surviving family members testified about a rigid hierarchy where Marcus was the absolute authority, where children were taught that questioning his decisions was tantamount to defying God himself. Kiani Wesson, who had survived the massacre by shielding younger children with her own body, took the stand with visible scars, both physical and emotional. Her testimony revealed the full extent of her father's manipulation. "He taught us that the outside world was evil," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said that people out there would try to separate our family, and that we had to be willing to die rather than let that happen. He made us practice what we would do if the police ever came." The courtroom fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Marcus Wesson hadn't just created a cult, he had trained his own children to participate in their own destruction. Dr. Sarah Williams, a forensic psychologist who had studied the case extensively, explained to the jury how Marcus had used classic cult indoctrination techniques within his own family. "Mr. Wesson created an environment of total dependency," she testified. "The children had no frame of reference for normal family relationships, no understanding that what was happening to them was abuse. To them, their father's word was literally the word of God." The prosecution also revealed the financial motivations behind Marcus's control. For years, he had collected welfare benefits for his numerous children while forcing them to live in squalid conditions. The money that should have been used for their care had instead funded his lifestyle and his ability to maintain control over the family. Perhaps most disturbing were the details about the forced marriages and sexual abuse that had occurred within the family. Marcus had convinced his daughters and nieces that bearing his children was a religious duty, creating a cycle of abuse that had produced multiple generations of victims. Ruby Ortiz, one of the women whose custody dispute had triggered the police response, testified about her desperate attempts to save her children from the house. "I knew something terrible was happening there," she said through tears. "But every time I tried to get help, Marcus would convince the authorities that I was just a disgruntled relative trying to cause trouble." The defense team, led by attorney David Jones, faced an almost impossible task. How do you defend a man whose actions had resulted in the deaths of 9 children? Their strategy focused on Marcus's mental state, arguing that years of religious extremism had left him genuinely unable to distinguish between right and wrong. "Marcus Wesson is not a monster," Jones argued. "He's a deeply disturbed man who became so consumed by his religious beliefs that he lost touch with reality. He genuinely believed he was protecting his children from a corrupt world." But the prosecution's case was overwhelming. The evidence showed a pattern of calculated manipulation and abuse that spanned decades. This wasn't the work of a man who had simply lost his way. It was the systematic exploitation of vulnerable children by someone who understood exactly what he was doing. The trial lasted 3 months, with testimony from dozens of witnesses and experts. The jury heard about the physical conditions in the house, the isolation of the children from the outside world, and the gradual escalation of abuse that had culminated in the massacre. When the verdict was finally read, Marcus Wesson showed no reaction. He was found guilty on 9 counts of first-degree murder and 14 counts of sexual abuse. The jury recommended the death penalty, a decision that was later upheld by the judge. But for the surviving family members, the trial's end brought little closure. The children who had escaped the house that night faced years of therapy and rehabilitation, trying to learn how to function in a world they had been taught to fear. Kiani Wesson, now in her early 20s, struggled with survivor's guilt and the challenge of raising her own children without the twisted framework that had defined her entire life. "I have to learn how to be a mother without using my father's example," she said in a rare interview. "I have to learn what real love looks like." The case prompted changes in how law enforcement and social services handle reports of domestic abuse, particularly in cases involving religious extremism. Training programs were developed to help officers recognize the signs of family-based cults and to understand the unique challenges involved in extracting victims from such environments. The house on Hammond Avenue was eventually demolished, but the lot remained empty for years. Neighbors reported that no one wanted to build on the site where such horror had occurred. It became an unofficial memorial to the 9 children who had died there, a reminder of the price of unchecked authority and the vulnerability of those who depend on others for protection. Marcus Wesson remains on death row, still maintaining that his actions were justified by his religious beliefs. He has shown no remorse for the deaths of his children, no acknowledgement that his teachings led directly to their destruction. The case continues to be studied by psychologists, criminologists, and social workers as an extreme example of how family structures can be perverted to serve the interests of those in power. It serves as a stark reminder that the greatest threats to children often come not from strangers, but from those who claim to love them most. For the community of Fresno, the Wesson case became a watershed moment, a recognition that evil can hide behind the facade of family and faith, and that protecting children requires constant vigilance against those who would exploit their trust and vulnerability. The 9 children who died on Hammond Avenue, Sabrina, Ilabel, Lise, Jeva, Ethan, Sedona, Marshy, Jonathan, and Aviv, are remembered not just as victims, but as a call to action for all those who work to protect the innocent from those who would harm them in the name of love. Their deaths were not in vain if they served to prevent other children from suffering the same fate, if they remind us that the bonds of family must be built on genuine love and respect rather than fear and control. The case of Marcus Wesson stands as one of the most disturbing examples of domestic terrorism in American history, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who hide behind the mask of righteousness, and that the price of failing to protect our most vulnerable citizens can be measured in young lives lost to the darkness of human evil.